As we start this new series on family, We Are Family, we're going to get into a whole bunch of different things for the next 3 weeks. And I think you'll probably say, I'm not going to say anything new. But sometimes we need a good reminder. Sometimes we need to push reboot and start all over again. And I think we'll experience some of those kind of things over the next little bit. But today, let me start with this. We all have times in our families that we have just brilliant memories. And I don't know about you, but as our kids grew, there was points in time in their development where the family was just great. And then there was other times, right? This picture here was we were in Calgary, and it was just one of those times the kids were at the age when it was just awesome, right? And we all have that. But it changes. And kids grow up and kids change, and sometimes that's very difficult, but you know what? It's still family, and that's an important part. Every family has that one person that's the head scratcher, right? Well, my great-grandmother, I think, was the model. They modeled the character Yoda after her, I think. And it's just interesting, and lots of stories. When they were in Macedonia, and lots of stories there. But you know what? We also have fantastic memories. And I remember the day I got to meet SpongeBob. And I was excited about getting this picture, and I had to drag my kids into it to make it look like they were getting their picture with SpongeBob. But we all have great memories. Our hallway at home is lined with pictures from floor to ceiling. And it's all family, as far back as we could find. Pictures of family. And I know many of you have lots of those memories around your house and hanging on the walls because we value that. But you know what? The truth is not all of our memories are great. And sometimes what happens in our family changes the dynamic in a negative way that really kind of messes things up. I was a teenager. My sister was, I think, 16 years old when she left home. And we had packed up as a family and went out, and I don't know if she said she was sick or whatever. She didn't go, and we came home, and she was gone, and there was a note. You know, that altered our family. At 16 years old, my dad died. That changed. These are not pleasant memories, but it's family. And as families go, and as families grow, and as things change, things get fractured, things get messed up, but we're family. What happens when we talk about family? The truth is there's all kinds of different emotions that are raised. Positive ones and negative ones. Some people are growing up and have grown up in families that were troubled and with lots of issues and tension or maybe anger and abuse. Some grew up in families that just functioned wonderfully. And we have all of these different things going on, but I think constant change is part of family. One day, hopefully not very soon, my kids will show up with somebody that they'll bring home that they want to join our family. Now, many of you have experienced that already. I need to hear some answers sometime. What happens if they bring somebody home that I don't like? I'm worried about that. I love the way our family gets along and we function and everything. And what if someone comes into the mix that just doesn't fit? And that changes the whole thing. I think we have to struggle through some of those kind of things. What if new people become part of my family and I don't like them? And we risk wrecking what we've got? Or at least it's changing. But every stage of the family and every stage of parenting means constant change. So the question I want to look at today, what is family? Not in the sense of our biological or adopted families, but in the church. Is the church a family? I think all those things I've talked about showing these pictures, I think all of them are alive in the church. All of them, all these great things and all these problem things. But I've been part of church pretty much my whole life. And if I'm honest, I would say that some of those experiences were family. And they were rich, and they were deep, and those people were every bit as much family as my family was. But there's other churches that I've been part of that really weren't like that at all. And everywhere in between. And we have, over the last little while, lots of new people coming in here. And some of them tell me, wow, I've never come into a church where I've experienced this much friendliness and acceptance and love right away. And they're feeling that right away. But at the same time, we have people who have been here a year and are still saying, wow, this church is hard to crack into. How do we get both of those in the same group? I'll tell you, my hope, my desire would be that everybody that comes in through those doors feels like they're at home. Feels like they have come home. That they know and experience the depth of family, and they're embraced that way. And that really starts with those of us who are already here. In the next couple of weeks, as we look at this, Andy will be speaking next week. And Andy looking at the same thing from a completely different perspective, because Andy was adopted. And in the last year, as Andy got married and now has adopted into a new family, Andy moved here last March. And so in a sense, we've adopted him into our family. How does that work in the church? And how do we treat new people who are here, who are adopted into our family? How do they feel coming in? We want to look at some of those kind of things. The next week after that, Ken will be speaking. And you know very well what's happened in Ken's family the last little while, as Adeline has been born. And our families, when we have a new child, it changes. Lots changes. And I've said lots of times, that's the best thing in the world and the worst thing in the world at the same time. But how does that happen in the church, and what does that look like in the church? How does that parallel when someone brand new comes in who maybe is far from God and doesn't know how it works or what we do or what this means or what that means? How do we deal with them and how do we treat them? And in the same way in our families, we grow our families by reproducing ourselves, and we do that in the church too. Well, are we? Ken will deal with some of those kind of things. Both of those experiences are just like changes we experience in our real homes. This morning, though, I just want to kind of crack open the issues or get our heads wrapped around the family dynamic of the biblical church. Because 2,000 years ago, as the church was initiated and started to shape, family was absolutely critical. To be a family, to feel like family, to be shoulder to shoulder with people that are my family was absolutely critical in that first church as it started. So if you've been around here the last little while and you've rubbed shoulders with me at all, I think at least 3 times on Sunday mornings I've talked about this same passage of Scripture. If you have a Bible, go to Ephesians chapter 3. I want to start there this morning, and it's the passage that Annette read for us from the piano a few minutes ago. I'm not going to read it now, but I've been talking about this prayer, Paul's prayer for his church. And he prays there that out of the glorious riches of God, that he would give us, that he would grant us an inner strength, a deep inner strength. He prays that we would have Christ dwelling in our hearts. And what does that look like? And what does that mean that we would really know that? That we would be rooted and grounded in love. He prays that we would be, that we would know, and not just know, to really, 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 really know the breadth and the height and the depth of God's love. And then he concludes the prayer with, that we would be filled with the fullness of God. Well, over the last month or so, I have begun to pray that for our church, for every single one of you by name. Those exact things. I pray this for my neighbors. I pray this for my friends in the community that are far from God, because I think these things underneath them touch everything, that this is what we are. This is what we need. People who are far from God, to know Christ living in their hearts, to be rooted in love, to have the fullness of God. And so we pray this, and I've begun to do that for all of us. But if this was our full-on 100% life experience every day, what would change? I think our families would change. I think our street would change. Our neighbors would change. I think our church would change. I think it would have a huge impact. Interestingly, this prayer that he prays in Ephesians comes right after a conversation about the church. And he calls the church a family. So over in chapter 2, starting at verse 11, he's talking about the church. And there's the Jews and the non-Jews. And they are in disagreement about everything. The Jews won't even walk down the same street as the non-Jews. They're dirty, they're disgusting. They look at them with this gross superiority. They're almost enemies. They're different, they're separated, they're enemies. And Paul says, Jesus brought you together in peace. Well, that would be hard for them because they completely disagree, right? And so he says, Jesus brought them together, and then he says, you were far off, far from God. Your lifestyles were in opposition to each other, yet Jesus brought you near and gave you the same Spirit. And then look at verse 19, chapter 2. He says, so then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but your fellow citizens with the saints, and look at this, and members of the household of God. People who were directly opposed to each other, who disagreed on everything. He says, Jesus made you members of the household of God. Household, that word, household here, absolutely means family. But it's more than that. It's bigger than that because it implies 100% devotion and commitment to family. There is nothing separating us. Imagine that. Now, this is impossible, right? To have that much difference and separation. Look at how he ends that chapter 3. Look at verse 20. In him who is able to do far more abundantly than all we ask or think, according to the power at work within us. For us, this is impossible. For God, this is nothing. God's household, because of Jesus, has created us spiritual siblings. Not figuratively, literally. Spiritual siblings with the same Father. So think about this. The differences were so strong they wouldn't even walk on the same street. They're unclean, broken, hurt. There was tension, there was fear, and that was completely restored in peace, and they were brought together as family. Now, our part of Ontario is full of people who have been hurt by church, who have been hurt by church people. And this room has people in it who have been hurt. People who have been chased away from church or broken because of church people. And church splits after church splits and heated arguments. And then hypocrites, people who say they follow Jesus but none of their life looks like that, has driven people from the church. All things are possible with God. And his intent in the cross of Christ was to make us family. We all have friends that are not family, but they're friends, and they're so good friends that we call them family. My kids have uncles and aunts that aren't uncles and aunts. We know that. We understand that. And I want to establish that this morning in our minds when we think about church. A number of years ago when I was teaching youth ministry at Ambrose, I started working with another school as we were trying to partner in how we approached our training of youth pastors. And I got to know this former youth pastor who was teaching youth ministry in another school. And it wasn't long as we discussed that we realized there was one thing that we completely disagreed on as it approached ministry. Now, this pastor, this teacher had been so convinced of this that he went and got his doctorate and he did his whole dissertation on this issue. And this was his issue. The church is not a family. And we should not have deep family-level relationships in the church. because it causes hurt. And he spent his whole doctoral education and 10 years after that teaching this to youth pastors. Don't enter into deep, connected relationships with the kids. Well, folks, I completely disagreed. My whole philosophy of that was it takes a youth pastor 2 years in a church before he gets to the place where they feel like these are my kids. And when they feel like they're my kids, then we can really start deep heart discipleship work. And we had disagreed on that like crazy. And we had it out lots of times over about 3 years. After about 5 years in teaching youth ministry, he walked away from that job. And about 3 years later, he walked away from faith. Why? Because he was all alone. He refused to open up. He refused to engage with people. He refused to develop relationships in the church that are so desperate to our faith. Research tells us that it takes a senior pastor or lead pastor 5 years to get there with the people. With no deep connections, no family-like relationships because there's too much risk, if that's the principle we live by, we will never experience love. I had a conversation with a young man in our church a couple of weeks ago who wanted to come and talk to me because he had a girlfriend and he poured his heart into her. And he opened up and became vulnerable and really loved her, and she wasn't at the same level and walked away. And what happened? He was absolutely crushed, confused, frustrated, just crushed and didn't know what to do. And how could somebody do that? And as we talked, we realized he has a choice. Because either he could become jaded and crusty and never open up again like that to somebody to make sure I never feel like this again. Or he can realize that if I want to experience love, I have to every day become that vulnerable to hurt. And we talked through that decision. I believe if you're ever going to really find love, you have to risk that hurt every single day. The truth is, lots of you have been hurt by the church. And I think we have that same choice. Because either we step away or step back and say, I'll never be hurt like that again. And sometimes that means we walk away from church. Sometimes we stay, but we put up big cement walls with barbed wire around the top, and I'm not going to enter into these kind of deep relationships. Some people drag others into their vortex of their hurt and disenfranchise people around them. Or you can take the risk and make yourself vulnerable again and maybe get hurt again. But that's the risk that's necessary if you're going to find family. So I want to simplify it today with one picture. I believe that if you ever want to experience what God has for you, you've got to, in humility and complete vulnerability, open up and jump in with both feet and take that risk. And for some of you, that's not easy. In reality, for most of us in the church is not family. Something is broken. So what I'd like to do is go back to the beginning. Let's rewind back to the first century when church started. And even though the culture is completely different, and even though what I'm going to say doesn't necessarily fit our world today, there's a lot of transferable things. But come with me on this journey. Let's go back to the beginning and go to Mark chapter 3. This is a really hard passage. I honestly don't think I've ever heard a sermon on this passage of Scripture before because it's so often twisted and misunderstood. In Mark chapter 3, Jesus goes home. Jesus has been out and he's been working and traveling and collecting his disciples, and he goes home. And it was not a good experience for him. You see, what's happening here is he shows up back at home, and the crowd is so huge, it says, that they couldn't even eat. There were so many people. And if you're there, Mark chapter 3, verse 20 and 21 says, when he went home and the crowd gathered again, and there were so many they could not even eat, Look at this. When his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying, he's out of his mind. Jesus' brothers and his mother went to get him because this is out of control. We've got to stop this. I wonder what was going on in Mary's mind there. Because Mary knew all of this from before he was born, right? Is Mary trying to protect him? Is Mary trying to protect him from his brothers? We don't know any of that, but we do know that his brothers and his mother came to this house they were at. And what Jesus was doing, he's with this big crowd and he's casting out demons, and they're having conversations about evil spirits, and there's these wacky things happening, and then all of a sudden we see in verse 22 and 23 that the religious leaders there started accusing Jesus of being possessed by Satan himself. And this whole situation is escalating. And so we come to verse 31, and his mother and his brothers came. Standing outside, they sent to him and called him. And the crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you. Look at what Jesus says. Who are my mother and brothers? And looking at those sitting around him, he said, here are my mother and brothers. Whoever does the will of God, he is my mother and sister, brother and sister and mother. What was Jesus saying? Was Jesus saying, I don't care who you are, mom, brothers, I don't need you anymore, get out of here, this is my family. Is that what Jesus is saying? We know that's not true, because as we follow this through the rest of his life, he did have relationship with his brothers and his mother. We come to at the cross, and Mary is there, and very soon afterwards, his brother James becomes a huge leader in the church in the book of Acts. He was one of the most significant leaders. He took a flip here. But here, these guys are not okay with what Jesus is doing. He's out of his mind, and they come to seize him. I think here what Jesus is saying, he's not being rude. He's not messing with his family. He's not trying to turn them around in disregard. But I think what I see here is Jesus realizes that his family is trying to turn him from what God wants to do. And he says, these people right around me here, they're doing God's will. They want to see God's will happen. That's my family. Is that a negative statement towards his family? I think what Jesus is saying is, I want to live a God-centered life, and I will surround myself with people who are doing that. And there will be a deep level of commitment to them, with them, and transparency and openness and vulnerability, because we're on the same page, we're heading the same direction, and I will be open with them. I will surround myself with people that are doing that. You know, hundreds of people follow Jesus, and they all had demands on him. They all wanted part of his time and his attention, but who did he spend the most relational energy on? It was the few around him. I thought to myself this week, do I really want to live a God-centered life? Then who am I closest to? Who are the people in my life that I am most open and vulnerable with? And are they opposed? Or are they the ones that are actually going to help me be successful living that way? Jesus had a few very deep, open, share the stuff that nobody knows with kind of relationships. These are the ones, he says, who know me, who get me, who understand what we're doing, and they're hanging around, they're still here. And Jesus defines that as family. In John chapter 15, you don't need to go there if you don't want. In John chapter 15, this is the day Jesus is arrested. He's talking with his disciples, And this is where he's talking about the vine and the branches, and he's talking about how they have to be grafted into him. I mean, if that's not a picture of the deepest relationships, right? We're not just sharing a field, we're actually grafted into the same plant. And Jesus there is talking about these relationships. And he says to his disciples, you know everything there is to know about me. I have told you everything about the kingdom. I've told you everything about the Father. And actually, you're all going to experience trouble because of it. And you're all going to die because of it. This is how Jesus is defining family, with that depth of relationship. And I believe every person in this room needs that level of confident relationships with other people who are following Christ. And if the people in my life with that deep, deep, confident relationship are not heading the same direction spiritually, I'm going to have a horrible time trying to follow. Jesus set the church up as family. Here's why, okay? So I'm going to run off on a little train of thought here. Stay with me and we'll come back, okay? But here's why it was set up as family in the first place. Go to, before I go there, in that day, in that culture, family was the center of everything. Way more than we know today. It was the center of everything. Growing up, it was going to be the center of your career. It was the center of your friendships, relationships. In the home would be all of the generations of your family who are living in the same home. Everything centered around that. All of your wealth and your future wealth came from there. Your career came from there. Your connections, your friends, your status in town, your influence and your people, your circle, your people were centered around the home. Everything was like that. And the level of commitment to home was higher than everything. If you chose to follow Jesus, you're out. Unless your father chose to. Because the father in the home was the only one who had the right or the permission to make a choice like that. And if the father chose our family is going to follow God, the whole family did and nobody could buck it. There was that level of commitment to the family. So if you chose to follow Christ, chances are more than likely you had to walk from your family. You would lose your place in town. You'd be thrown out of the synagogue. You would lose all of your connections, all of your friends, all of your value, and your family would treat you as dead. My mom, at 22 years old, came to Christ in a family like this. And her family was absolutely opposed. She snuck out to go to church. She fell in love with somebody at the church and brought him home. They were getting married, and my mom's family was 100% opposed to that. On the night before the wedding, they held a wake in their home. On the day of the wedding, my mom's whole family wore black and came, but they treated it like a funeral. Jesus is saying, I will provide what you need. Jesus is saying, I will provide what you need. Imagine being forced to walk away from your home, and now you have no family, you're alone, you're broken, you're desperate. I kind of feel like there's lots of people trying to follow Christ, but they're feeling that way. Let's translate that culturally a little bit, because we live in a world full of broken families. Our census tells us that there's more broken families than there are healthy families. Is the church providing a picture of what a family ought to be? I'm not sure it is. Because within the church there's just as much distance and hurt and splits and blended and broken and selfish. But when the church was initiated, it was to become a place where you could be surrounded with family scale relationships. so tight, so transparent, together in unity and support, that if you had been kicked out of your family, you had a new family. It was set up originally as a replacement family for rejects. Now here's the beauty. If they were rejected, and they were orphaned, and they were broken, and they were hurt, whether it's singles or families or whatever, you're mixed in with those who are healthy and vibrant, and families that are functioning, and they come together very much like that passage in Ephesians, that this and the distant and the separated come together, and we are family. In that world, it was a replacement family. It was a community knit together with serious commitment to each other. Now, for most of us, we weren't forced to choose between our family and following God. We have the benefit of having both, most of us. What a blessing that is. As the church began to emerge, we see it starting to take shape in Acts chapter 2. Right at the end of Acts chapter 2, we see that the church start to actually gather and meet together. And this is the first record we have of that. It was a great gift to people who were being rejected from their family. It was a great gift for them. But it was individuals, and it was whole families. In Acts chapter 2, at the very end, we see they really did life together. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, and to prayer, and to the fellowship. Now, interesting, that phrase right there. Because in many of our Bible translations, it says they devoted themselves to prayer and fellowship. In the English Standard Version that I'm reading here, it doesn't say that. It says that they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship. Now in English, that's a huge difference between devoting themselves to fellowship or devoting themselves to the fellowship. Huge implications in the difference that. You see that, right? But so I had to go do some digging this week to find out, is there a correct, is there a not correct, which should it be? Because we could have people over to our house like we did the other night, and we had a great meal together. We spent the evening laughing and talking and everything. We think, what great fellowship. But that's not the meaning of the word fellowship. You know that, right? That's a misuse of the word. Because fellowship is joining together with deep commitment to travel to the same direction. As followers of Christ, we are traveling towards Christ, and we are deeply devoted and committed to each other. And when we come together to live together, to do life together in that direction, that's called fellowship. So the truth is, whether your translation says devoted to fellowship or devoted to the fellowship, in the original Greek language, there's no difference. Because this is who we are journeying together with, and I am devoted to this, is what it says. How many of us are really devoted to fellowship? They met in the temple for their big group, for their worship and for their teaching. They met daily in the homes. Acts shows us that lots of times. They ate meals together. They were devoted to each other. It was so good that everyone wanted in, and they grew by the hundreds and the thousands. They were so devoted to each other. They had dads and moms and kids and families and singles, and they were all one big family sharing everything, and they really took the family part of that seriously. And there was over 3,000 people already. So how do you do that? The church, as it was initiated, was to become a place where you were surrounded with family-like, family-scale depth relationships, so tight, transparent together in unity and support that if you had been kicked out of your family, you had a new family. It didn't take long, though, before it was struggling. And most of the rest of our New Testament is letters to churches dealing with problems they were having. Look at the Corinthians, 2 really long letters, correcting them on a lot of different things. But guess what? It wasn't perfect. It wasn't perfect because it's people. And you put a whole bunch of people in the room, and we're going to have disagreements and issues and fights, and we're not going to see eye to eye, and that's just the way it is. But guess what? We're family, so we live with that. And we put that, so we do that in our families, right? We don't always agree, and we see differently, and there's people that I get along with better than others, but we're family, and I'm not walking away. Those that were rejected found what they needed: acceptance, belonging, commitment, and love. So following Jesus calls for a completely new way of doing life. We desperately need each other if we're going to live that way. We need the close, vulnerable relationships. We need to be pushed and challenged. We need the care and we need the support. We need to be constantly pointed back in the direction of Jesus. And we need to be that in the lives of others. Is this your church experience? Likely if you come on Sundays and that's it, you're probably not feeling that. Likely if you're the last one in and the first one out, you're not feeling that. If you've been hurt by others, then maybe you're hesitant to really jump in and become deep. But this is not church. Church isn't something we do or a place that we go. Church is a family. It's people, like-minded, heading in the same direction. My hope is that we become a perfect picture of people living together, following Jesus, and functioning like a family. So why bother? Do we really need this? Why do people join a gang? We don't have maybe gangs around here. You live in the big city, and I have no experience with this, but I see it on the news. Why would a kid growing up in inner city Chicago join a gang? Unless there's something broken at home or in their heart, and they're looking for something. They're looking for belonging. They want to matter. They're looking for a commitment to other people. Someone who's got my back. Someone who would take a bullet for me. They want to belong. We all need to belong. It becomes like a replacement family. Do people join because they aren't getting what they need someplace else? People join church for the same reason. Sadly, both often break down because we're people. People always let people down. And I'm sure in gangs that some people don't join because they're seeking something. I think some people join, yes, because of a void they need to fill, but others join because they're coerced or pressured or threatened. I think many in the end don't find what they're really looking for. And I'm assuming that some gang members are abused and mistreated. Sadly, that happens in the church too. Let's reverse that. I have good friends who live in Calgary who their kids are grown and out of the house now. But all the years that they were raising their kids, they had a phrase they used, and they worked hard to establish this. They called it home court advantage. And if you're a sports fan, you know what that means. That when we're playing in our home rink or our home stadium and the crowd is all cheering for us, that gives us an advantage over the other team, right? How bad is it when our own crowd is booing for us? That home court advantage is what my friends established in their home. That out there the world is harsh and the world will beat us up and knock our knees out and frustrate us and hurt us. But that's not going to happen here. And they worked hard to establish that in their home. The home court advantage. And you know what? We desperately need that in the church. Beauty is we have, in most cases, both families. My family at home is good and pointing me to Jesus. The family at church is good and pointing me to Jesus, and Jesus is number one priority. If that's your story, then how blessed are you to have both? Whether it's a biological family or adopted family or my church family, how great is it when it's actually functioning well? But how horrible is it and harsh is it when it's not? By jumping into deep relationships like it's supposed to be, is a huge risk of hurt. You know what the number one blockade of that is? It's trust. So lack of trust is the number one thing that will hold this back. The New Testament has about 60 one another's. Are you aware of that? You know what I mean by that? How to treat one another, love one another, bear one another's burdens. And there's about 60 of them. And we take those and say this is part of the context of the church. But some of those are great when we think of, there's 100 people here, there's 400 on a lot of Sunday mornings. Some of them are great when I think there's 400 people and that's wonderful. Some of them is like, whoa. Like James chapter 5, confess your sins to one another. Anybody interested in standing up with a microphone in front of 400 people and confessing your sins? Why? It's right? It's not going to happen. What about bear one another's burdens? I can't do that for 300 people. I can't do that for 12 people. We have to get a handle on this. We have to figure out how this works. The each other part, though, is absolutely necessary in our lives. We've got to have a spiritual family that I trust enough to be open and transparent and to live that way. And the spirit, we need the spiritual family, my spiritual siblings, to know when I'm faking it and to be able to call me out on that. It's not going to happen with more than 5 to 10 people. Doesn't matter how big the church is. That's not going to happen with more than 5 to 10 people. So am I surrounding myself with the 5 people or the 10 people that are going to be my family spiritually? We need life groups. And that's why we have them in our church. And life groups have to be more than Bible study prayer time. Life groups really have to become the place where these family-level commitments happen, where I can really live the Christian lives with others that are close enough to really know me like family. It's not going to be perfect, but we walk together with Jesus. Have you ever been in a group like that? I think that life groups, those small family-scale deep relationships, need to become the foundational, life-giving heartbeat of our church. That isn't going to happen on Sunday mornings. This is here where we all gather together to celebrate, to sing, to worship, and to learn together, but then we need to go into the small family-sized groups and figure it out and process it and work through it and live it and push each other and do the day-to-day part with each other, where we have each other's back, where no one is alone, and we let people inside my head and life enough that they can kick around. I'm not doing that with more than 5 or 10 people. But do you have people who are walking well with God, who have permission to climb inside your head and kick around? We cannot thrive without that. When I am in my church, when I'm in my family, I want to know the depth of care and the depth of nurture and training and maturing and committed to each other over the long haul. Even if we disagree, we're family, and we're in it with love and acceptance and forgiveness and family. And that takes work. And most of all, it takes grace. Here's my challenge for you. I wrote down 15 or 20 questions here. Here's my challenge for you. Are you leaning into this? Are you being treated and accepted as family? And if not, is that on them or is that on you? Are you treating others like family? Are you being distant and closed off, whether consciously or unconsciously? Do you complain more than you celebrate? Are you bringing your hurt from the past into this? Instead of seeking healing and health, are you spreading it and bringing others into your hurt? Are you being treated with life-giving grace? Are you treating others with life-giving grace? And who are the people around you that are following Jesus well, who are really on the inside of your life? Not arm's length, not even side by side, but people who really know what makes you tick and have permission to mess around with it and to challenge you. What about new people? We've had a lot of new people come into our church in the last year. How do we accept them in? Do we treat them as family? Or do we keep them at arm's length and hope someone else does? Some of you are new. As I said, my hope is that everyone that walks in through our doors immediately feels, I came home. That's how Jesus set up the church, to literally be spiritual siblings. And the truth is, every time someone new comes in, or someone dies off, or a new baby is born, the entire dynamic changes. And sometimes we get it to the place where I really like this, but then new people comes in and it tilts it. Well, guess what, folks? Every stage of life changes. And we need to continue to move forward. As long as we are humans, it isn't going to be perfect. But don't let that keep you from diving in. Here's the last thing I want to say. Jesus says that the church is the bride of Christ. The church is the bride. Jesus is the bridegroom. And we've talked about that cultural marriages before, but in really short, upon the engagement, the groom would leave for a long period of time, and the bride would get ready. And when the father said it was time, the son would come back to his bride and take her home. But that whole period where she's waiting, not knowing when he's coming back, the bride is supposed to be getting ready. What's that look like? Right? There's work involved. And there's the dream of doing everything I possibly can to line up with and match and be ready. Folks, I really feel the church, especially the church in Canada, is not ready. The bride is not ready. And a few months ago, I was dealing with this and really struggling with a lot of things, and Jesus really simply whispered in my ear, prepare the bride. So I want to invite you into that. Will you join me in preparing the bride for the bridegroom? That means you individually. That means us when we're together. That means us when we're not together. This is the church, and we are family. Yes, there's some hurt. Yes, there's distance. Yes, there's brick walls between us. But how would we deal with that in our family? You don't walk away. You don't just shut the door. We deal with it. Let's be family. We need trust, and we need grace. Let's pray. Our Father, thank you for the church. And across a room like this, in our room this morning already, there are so many different backgrounds and so many different experiences. There's lots of hurt, there's lots of frustration, there's lots of brilliant memories. But God, you have brought us together for right now to be your church. God, may we be a beautiful picture of the bride of Christ. Would you do what is necessary in us? Give us the grace that we need, that we might begin to develop these relationships. It doesn't mean we hang out together every day, and do everything together. But God, may we, like family, be open and transparent and vulnerable and care and give and share and pour into each other, journeying together in fellowship towards you. God, help us to be a welcoming church to new people, whether they love Jesus or whether they're far from you. to love them with the same love and the same grace and be accepting into our family. God, make us a beautiful picture of what you intended as a church. Would you do your work in us and then do your work through us that we might point people to Jesus? Amen.